Good morning and welcome to this Ask the Experts session. We appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us. I want to introduce myself. My name is Crystal Cardenas and I'm the project coordinator for the Center for Innovation and Resources and the UP project. Before we get started, I just want to cover a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar is produced by the Underserved Victims Population Training Project, a project of the Center for Innovation and Resources. Funding for this project comes from the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services Victim Services Branch, with funding made possible through the United States Department of Justice Victims of Crime Act. For those of you who can hear me, this might seem obvious, but I just want to remind everyone to turn on their speakers in order to hear the presentation. Please use the Q&A feature to ask the presenter any questions that you may have. We will begin with questions that have been emailed in prior to the live session. You may ask questions anonymously by checking the anonymous box on the Q&A feature. And I just also want to encourage all the participants to ask the questions earlier rather than later. It is only a 30-minute Ask the Expert session. And a lot of the times what I found is that participants will ask questions in the last 5 minutes and we don't have an opportunity to answer all of the questions in the 30 minutes. So if you have any questions for Bill, please enter them into the Q&A feature earlier rather than later. The chat panel. The chat panel is where you can ask any tech support questions. We will answer your questions immediately in the chat panel. I also wanted to let everyone know that there will be an evaluation that's automatically populated during this session. Please take a few minutes after the session to fill out the evaluation. We value the feedback we receive from all of our training. Now I would like to introduce and welcome our presenter, Bill Burmester. Bill has been a licensed marriage and family therapist in private practice in Berkeley, California since 1994, with training and experience in the treatment of sexual abuse and other relational and developmental trauma. He has worked with child, adolescent, and adult survivors of sexual abuse, especially men, adolescent and adult perpetrators, and abusive family systems. He facilitates groups for men healing from sexual abuse and treatment issues of women using psychodynamic approaches, EMDR, sensor, motor psychotherapy, IFS, and mindfulness practices. He has been a facilitator with the national organization Men Healing Weekends of Recovery program since 2002. So thank you so much, Bill, for doing this Ask the Expert first session for us. We're really excited about having you.
My pleasure.
So we're going to start with the first question that was emailed in, which is, how can we help our boys tap into their emotions?
I chose this question because I really like the fact that we all play a role in what happens to the next generation of boys. And the answer, as an explanation, is incredibly simple, but we may not all be used to this as an orientation, since a lot of the social assumptions about what will help boys become boys and men growing up are not always conducive to them sharing their emotional lives. The obvious answer is to simply be curious when boys share their emotions and to invite them to share more, to be curious, to ask what's going on, because it brings their emotional lives into dialogue and into relationship. And one of the most difficult things is that at a certain point in development, often mid-adolescence, boys get this notion that they're supposed to be self-sufficient and keep their feelings to themselves. And that often, as peer pressure, is involved in them getting ridiculed or somehow dissed for being too expressive or feminine, God forbid.
Okay, the second question is, how can we teach children not to equate masculinity with not being feminine?
This one I like as well, because it raises the whole question of the binary that we have in raising our kids, and everybody's probably familiar at this point with the terms non-binary and binary and so on. And I think both boys and girls are healthiest when they find a kind of fusion of assertive and receptive qualities. Girls seem to be leading the way, just as the whole feminist movement may have led the way for men to focus on their lives and their relationships. And I think to not label what seem like feminine qualities as somehow non-masculine. There's a certain, this is very kind of basic and slightly philosophical, but there's a way that thinking in general defaults to either or thinking. It's the way the left brain is set up to make distinctions so that some A is A because it's not B. But in fact, that's pretty fatal when it comes to gender development. And in fact, the people who are most mature and richest in character are the ones who can combine those two qualities. And even labeling something like receptivity or passivity is already a loaded word, but basically I'm thinking of it in terms of a person who's willing to listen and just be the witness of the other person is labeled as somehow not masculine enough because it's not assertive. Those shut down any of those kind of feedback loops that shut down kids' expressiveness or their natural instincts is not going to help boys in particular.
Right, and this question was chatted in, and it says, what special considerations around masculinity should we take into account for transgender men who have been victims of crimes?
Oh boy, that's a great specific question. I don't have a lot of experience with, are we talking about female to male?
Yes.
That I just had my first trans client, but the other direction, male to female. Though I have been in trainings and I have interacted some with this issue. I'm certainly not the expert in this case. I think we're talking about women transitioning to men. I would like to believe that actually is a more resource transition, since women already have the receptivity to know what is and isn't working in relationships. And I think women in general, this is kind of a cultural commentary, are much more entitled to be assertive and masculine, or at least to use qualities that have been traditionally thought of as masculine in ways that don't threaten or challenge their femininity. Now, obviously, there's a contingent of men who don't like that, and they will give blowback. But I think in a culture, I'm a little bit biased because we're in California and I live in Berkeley, of all places. But that's just the norm here. People appreciate women who are taking care of themselves and assert themselves and are active. So if there's any other feedback about that or questions, I'd be happy to field that.
Okay, we haven't gotten any yet, but I am going to transition to a question that was emailed in, which is, how do men cope after sexual abuse?
Oh boy, the simple answer about that is they tend to isolate. Sexual abuse is a crime of betrayal, even more so in many ways than a crime of physical damage. Obviously, there's a whole spectrum of sexual abuse. But usually, it's very rare that a boy is abused by somebody he absolutely doesn't know. This whole notion from the old days that abuse is perpetrated by men in trench coat who jump out of the bushes is really erroneous and kind of damaging. So the point here is that most boys are sexually abused by people they know and have trusted and have reached out to. And when that reaching out gets violated by being exploited and used, the message is, this kind of closeness is not safe and I'm out of here. And of course, that will affect people in their partnerships as well. Aside from the whole transition that happens, Niobe Way is a great source for adolescent development. And she talks about a transition that occurs in mid-adolescence where boys are kind of falling under the spell of the masculine imperative to be self-sufficient. Whereas she's done a lot of research, and boys before that age value their friendships a lot. And then get kind of talked out of that sort of connection and closeness and exchange and reliance at an emotional level on one another. So, and I think what happens is that then becomes a kind of, I will protect myself by not being exposed. And the irony of that is that it creates a backdrop of weakness, emotional weakness, and vulnerability that's supposed to be generating the opposite. If you're all closed down, then you're supposed to be protected. But in fact, there's still an alive emotional life that's getting no connection and no nourishment and no kind of healthy input. And I mean, we all know, especially among older men, how difficult it can be for men to be emotionally expressive. And unless it's anger, or kind of sexuality or lust. Those are stereotyped, accepted positions, emotional positions. But the more vulnerable side, and my whole point, both here and in the paper that I delivered, is that it takes a lot of guts and strength to risk being emotionally exposed. And it should be obvious, but it's not. And my hope is that that will come out of this conversation we're having.
Okay, and then the next question that was emailed in is, if a man is sexually abused as a child, how does it affect his relationships, especially with his partners?
Yeah, this is very allied to the previous question, and that is that men don't show up emotionally if they don't trust. And men whose trust has been violated or betrayed don't trust easily. So what I tell all my clients when they come to see me, I'm a psychotherapist, as I say, this process will depend upon us developing trust, but I have to earn it. It's not just a given. And I think that I would like to think that most women in relationships are sensitive enough to know when there's a blockage, but I think it can be very frustrating, and therefore there's a certain pressure. Why can't you just kind of open up and tell me what you really feel and think? But that also can so easily feel like coercion, and at a nonverbal level, that can trigger the experience of being manipulated or abused. So it's a tough prospect to start that dialogue and encourage men. And it takes a lot of back and forth. And sometimes it takes naming the process. Maybe the partner says, I really wish that you could kind of share more openly with me, but I see that it's really difficult. Tell me more about what gets in the way. So I think deferring to the authority of the man also, in terms of his internal experience, also allows him to draw on what's supposed to be masculine, which is that we have some sense of authority and control.
All right, thank you. We have a question chatted in, which is, in your opinion, how can we approach the African-American youth that associate being a thug or a gangster with being a man or masculine?
Oh boy, that's a great question for a white guy like me. I wish I had more experience, and I have worked with African-American clients and kids. I think the thug part of that group is a protection, and not to either discipline in the kind of incarcerating mode when somebody appears thuggish, but to stay curious. I mean, obviously, we're talking about contexts in which we're either in therapy or we're in some sort of social service setting where there's a dialogue going on. And once again, I would say what I just said about partners and men. Ask them what made them feel like they needed to be thuggish. I'm using that as an overall. And staying curious breaks that pattern of, I'm going to be in an authority struggle and somebody is going to try and exercise power over me, which is a perfect recipe for somebody being so-called oppositional. Why wouldn't they be?
Okay, our next question is, can a man be abused and not be affected or not be aware?
This raises the whole question of dissociation, and I'll try and talk a little bit about that. I believe that what happens, I laid out three different kind of post-traumatic identities. One where the abuser imitates, where the victim imitates the abuser and regains his sense of control by abusing in turn. Another that the victim internalizes that attacker and turns it against himself. And the third one is where children use a natural capacity for dissociation to just either blank out an entire assaultive or overwhelming abusive incident or experience. And just sometimes it's a complete erasure. It looks like one. But the body and the emotional part of the brain, the emotional system, amygdala and hypothalamus and all that, they register the impact of the shock. And that is triggerable later in life. That's the difficulty. So it may look like somebody is not affected by abuse. And of course, boys are not supposed to be vulnerable. So there are all kinds of boys. Keon Dooling's case is perfect. example of this, main case I presented when we spoke before, where he was clearly shocked and overwhelmed and traumatized, but he just made like nothing had happened and made sure he carried his knife. But as you saw from what happened later, the residue of the abuse is always triggerable. It depends how emotionally alive a man is. So there's a certain kind of reliability that comes with being able to heal, and that is you feel more. And so some people may be more triggerable. One of the most difficult experiences in my professional career is that I've had men come in to see me for the first time when clearly they're having memories or something is been stirred up. And they begin to open up, and then the floodgates open, and it's so overwhelming they flee. So it's a tricky business to work sensitively with men with sexual abuse histories, because we aren't prepared, maybe not all of us aren't perfectly prepared to deal with emotional overwhelm, but women are at least given the permission to be able to struggle with it, whereas it's emasculating for men, and they'll flee. So isolation is the biggest problem for partners in relationships, and it just takes developing a dialogue that feels trusting and mutual, collaborative. So.
Right, thank you. And I just wanted to, we're halfway through the session, so I just want to remind the participants, I know, I just wanted to remind all the participants on to submit their questions in the Q&A box if you have a question you'd like to ask Bill. So our next question is, what is healthy masculinity?
Oh boy, small topic, right?
Yes.
Well, I would say, kind of in a nutshell, healthy masculinity is an identity that welcomes in both sides of the binary, what's called feminine and what's called masculine. And so I would define healthy masculinity as a fusion and an amalgam and a balancing of those qualities, so that a man in partnership has the capacity to listen to his wife or his husband, openly when there's a lot of emotion circulating, rather than bail or get defensive. I don't think that those responses are actually particularly gendered. I think women are as likely to be defensive as men, but there's a certain kind of balancing of gender qualities where you both stay receptive, but you make sure that you're not going to get snowed or not heard. There's a certain level of assertiveness that's crucial. Healthy masculinity. I think healthy masculinity has a big component. I'm thinking about kids and being a parenting, of knowing how to nurture. And nurture is often just showing your kid or the kids in your life that you enjoy who they are. And it's not having to get too articulate or overwhelmed about it. There's a way where we can kind of lay a program on our kids. It's just genuinely finding the things that we like about them that are spontaneous and emotional. Even if they're difficult and there's a show of energy or charge, that quality in a kid is going to serve them in their lives where they need to assert themselves. And just for a parent or an uncle or whoever, just to say, I like that energy, to themselves. And the kids don't need to have it spelled out. They'll see it in your face. So, healthy masculinity, my God, it's such a huge topic. I think healthy men seek out other men for close relationships. And that's certainly not a given. We are supposed to be self-sufficient and independent and not need anybody. Again, let me just really recommend people check out Niobe Way's work on adolescence and what happens to boys as they're enculturated to be masculine in a way that actually weakens them.
Okay, our next question has been chatted in, which is, many of the examples you have offered relate to men or boys who were sexually assaulted by other males. Can you discuss the effects of boys who have been assaulted by females?
No, thank you so much. This is such an important question. I just thought of an expletive response to that, but I won't go there, obviously. It's a real mind mess up for boys, especially teenagers, but across the board, who are sexually exploited or used by women because they're both getting what they've been trained is desirable and having a really internally adverse experience. So they're left with a kind of conflict that is very disorienting. I've worked with a number of men who were sexually abused by their mothers. Often it takes a certain kind of mental orientation, psychotic sometimes, for mothers to do that to their boys, but not always. I think that often it's a reflection of the mother's own trauma history. And trauma histories have a life of their own. They're imprinted unconsciously as a pattern of behavior and interaction that, because they're so distressing, are often blocked from awareness or cognitive awareness. And under stress, mothers, as well as anybody else, can repeat what was done to them. It's that first kind of masculine identity, but this applies across the gender spectrum. I'm thinking of one client in particular who was abused by his mother, apparently briefly fondled in the bathtub when he was 6 or 7. He had the presence of mind to say, I hate this, and I am never going to be in a bathroom alone with you again, which is pretty amazing for a 5 or 6-year-old. I'm only going to, get bathed by my dad. But he has never been able to sustain an adult relationship. He identifies as straight. And he's incredibly accomplished, so he's gotten lots of support and esteem from his social world, but he's never been able, and he realizes at 70-something what a huge loss that has been. And he's now working in my men's group to try and recoup some of that openness. One of the issues, and this is just a very particular case, is that he is become perfectionistic. So after 2 or 3 months, no woman is good enough. And it's a way of reestablishing a sense of having control, some authority, and some standard that puts him away and above. And he was beginning to realize this, much to his credit. I know that's a specific case response to that question, but I hope it's helpful.
Yes, it was. Our next question is, how does trauma therapy explore healthy masculinity?
I would go back to the response that I was giving to parenting, which is not all that entirely different. Clearly, therapy is not parenting, but there's a dynamic in which at least I, as a therapist, enjoy what's in my male clients who are abuse survivors and have learned to shut down their rage or their anger or to be deferential or compliant. I always enjoy signs of their assertiveness, and I will invite it out. So I might say to somebody, isn't there anything I've done that you really disliked? To invite them into an honest interaction in the therapy situation, which should be safe enough. And one of the things that happens for both boys and girls is when they're sexually abused is they are trained and taught to defer to the will and control of others. Happens just as much to boys, but they often hide that piece as well. So I would say, what therapy can do is to notice those aspects of masculinity that are actually healthy and self-protective. And if there's an edge on them, like, working with somebody who uses their anger to hurt their partners, you take that on and say, that's a huge complex area, but you explore with them what it is that feels right about that way of regaining your ground, rather than something that's more collaborative. And take the answer seriously. Somebody would say, well, I can't trust her to get that I'm in charge of things. If I'm too nice. And then you just keep the questions going.
Thank you. Our next emailed question in is, how do you help a survivor who is afraid of his rage move forward with recovery?
Well, good. Well, I guess we put these questions in good sequence because that follows right from what we...
That's what I was thinking too.
I would say something very similar. I look for moments when men have an opportunity to exercise assertiveness, but are holding back. And I think that the locked up rage syndrome comes from assertiveness that doesn't get to be used in a healthy, normal way, where that message, I better just stand back and be deferential and do what others expect of me. And if that's too strong, then the natural self-assertiveness and rage, or at least outrage at being violated in some way, goes back, gets locked up, and the man develops a fear of his own protective energy. And then so doesn't see them as protective because there's all this fear that he's going to destroy the world. And there is a way. I mean, you saw it in the case of Keon Dooling, how, until he was triggered at age 32, he channeled all his kind of masculine expertise and aggression into the basketball court. But when this guy grabbed him and assaulted him, he almost killed him. Fortunately, he had a presence of mind to say, I don't deserve to get locked up for the rest of my life. So you do some reality testing around rage with men. You say, what's your greatest fear? If you were just open about what you're really feeling, what's the worst that could happen? Because that's something that has to be addressed. That assumption is what's keeping them from being able to use a healthy level of assertiveness and even aggression. And for whatever reason, I actually enjoy my clients' aggression. I think because I'm in a supervision environment that realizes there's something profoundly healthy about being able to draw on your assertiveness, whether you're a man or a woman, to take care of yourself. Because if we don't do that, we can't engage in intimacy. If you can't, some people say, if you can't say no, you can't say yes in intimate relations. And that applies here.
Okay, as a reminder, we only have a few minutes left, so if there's any burning questions, now's your chance.
Really. Now or never.
Exactly. Okay, so let's go to the next emailed question, which is, are admit, accept, stay connected all needed to move forward?
Wow, that's a good one. That's obviously coming from part of the presentation that I made, trying to spell out a solution for survivors who have been shut down by their abuse. I think I took this from a way, kind of other people's categories of responses to trauma and overwhelm. And there's a way of kind of moving away, which is the flight response, which is hardwired into our systems. There's a moving against, which is to fight, the fight response. And there's a moving toward, which is attach. And most of us are familiar with the kind of inherent trauma response patterns of fight, flight, and some people know freeze, which happens when and that's the basis of dissociation. But there are also a couple of others. And one is to submit, because it's a survival strategy that often works. And the other is just an inherent one from early childhood, which is to attach, which is to reach out. So a child in high distress will reach out because he realizes how vulnerable he is, even if it's to the person who's abusing him, which, needless to say, creates incredible crisis and turmoil internally. But that human response pattern to being in danger is to reach out. And that's where I came with the stay connected. So what I'm suggesting is that survivors need to be able to admit that they were hurt, and accept that the hurt made a difference and that they have a right to pay attention to it, but to stay connected as they begin going through that process. And that's kind of at the basis of all the groups I run. Well, I'd love to put in a plug for groups, but the groups I have for male survivors, that's where I think the real work happens. You have to prepare for it by being able to talk about the abuse history in individual therapy, but men come alive and begin reestablishing their relationships when they're in group with one another, because there's a basis of trust. They all know that everybody else was hurt in some way parallel to theirs, and it's an automatic kind of trust, although the group still has to develop that over the course of its life. But men just blossom. It's phenomenal to see. There's also a national version of this called Weekends of Recovery that the organization called Men Healing put on, where there are 3-day intensives, which create a much larger community in which everybody has this as a common base. And if you're interested in that, you can just Google menhealing.org as a therapeutic option.
Okay, so we're going to take our last question of the session, which is, what is it that makes men disclose after so much time has passed?
Desperation, a sense that they are dying inside, or maybe even in kind of suicidal state. That's the drastic answer to that. But I think also the media has done a fairly good job of covering the reality of abuse against boys, as it has with women, as it is now with just kind of a culture of general assaultiveness towards women. And I've talked too much, and you're going to have to remind me of the question, Crystal.
Oh, it was, what is it that makes men disclose after so much time has passed?
Well, the obvious answer was desperation, but the secondary answer is support. The right kind of support, one that doesn't treat them as victims. I think this is just a really crucial point, because part of masculine identity is that you're not a victim. So it makes it so difficult for men to say, yeah, I was hurt and compromised and it cost me, and because the sense is that it's going to be absolute. I'll be completely disempowered as a human being. So I think the support and curiosity, that's what allows men to continue to disclose. Often it's a crisis. I mean, men come in to see me as a therapist who works with sexual abuse issues because of a crisis in their life. Either they're and they are in a position to make good use of that crisis. And when I see them, that's often how I frame it. I don't say, gee, aren't you lucky that your wife is leaving you? I say, this is an opportunity that you might not have otherwise had to really get back in touch with the damage that you never chose, but have had to live with all your life.
All right.
All good questions.
Yes, they were. Thank you so much for submitting your questions. And thank you to Bill for giving us your time. This has been a very informative Ask the Expert session. So now I would like to end the session by reminding you all to take a few minutes to fill out the evaluation form. That's going to automatically populate for you, and enjoy the rest of your day.
And thank you for being involved and presenting such great questions. I really appreciate the chance to dialogue about this.